Communications, various other government members, and it's been quite a week actually. I've been really busy. I know there's a lot of discussion at the moment about what we should do on social media. Just to give you a bit of a background of my own research, I've been working on Indonesian media for about 15 years as a researcher and scholar at the Australian National University. I've been looking at Malaysia for about 8 years, first coming here for research purposes to look at the 2013 election in particular and the use of social media campaigning during the election. Can you all hear me at the back? Is that all good? I need to be a bit louder. A bit louder is better. Yeah, maybe turn it up a bit. I was just at the back before, it was too quiet. And more recently, I've been looking at the Philippines, and of course, the Philippines has been generally seen as patient zero of disinformation, largely due to the way in which the Duterte regime there has used online trolls and online social media campaigners to bring up his popularity and to push his policies. So I'll be talking more broadly about this research in these three countries. I'm from Australia, of course, and there's a lot of debate at the moment too about social media and media influence in Australia, but I don't specifically do on-the-ground research in Australia, but happy to give views occasionally if that's coming up. Obviously, this issue of disinformation and climate change is now a big topic in Australia at the moment. So there's my details, just to give you an idea of, can I get this go across? Okay. Can you go next one? Yeah, okay. Just to give you an idea of methodologies, most of what I'll be talking about today is research spending time with disinformation producers, i.e. trolls or cyber troopers or click farmers in some cases where we're talking about Instagram, but also buzzers in Indonesia. And I'm basically speaking about this topic by trying to talk about this new disinformation industry that is occurring globally, but also in particular in Southeast Asia. So I'll be talking about those personal interviews, but I've got some other methodologies here, which is just to show that a lot of my research is around elections and election campaigning and how social media campaigning is central now to elections in the region. But just also a shout out to some of my colleagues that we've worked on a project together in the Philippines, Jonathan Ong and Nicole Curato, and I'll put up the links to all this research at the end. I've also spent some time in rural areas and semi-rural areas of Malaysia during the last election in 2018. I was based mostly in Kedah and Langkawi, so some of my research will be talking just to individuals and citizens about the election campaign on the ground at the time. So, but most of what I'll be talking about is about the way in which social media campaigners see this digital era. What are they trying to do? How do they spread disinformation? And the three findings that we produced, in particular from the Philippines report just last year in 2019, was this rising trend of disinformation production. And so what we did in that case was interview a range of people. In some cases, disinformation producers are high-end public relations million-dollar companies that work for Coca-Cola or Coke Amatil or various other big international productions, and then they are hired by politicians in order to produce their public relations campaigns. In other cases, it's really low-level sole trader entrepreneurs who might be paid about $1,000 a month, who are really just trying to make a bit of money on the side as opposed to their normal everyday job. In some cases, we're talking about university students who are just getting money to create fake Facebook pages and doing it in a war room, not dissimilar to something like the size like this with their own laptops. And they're just doing it, say, for a couple of hours a day, or even they're just doing it for a week's worth of work. And once the election campaign ends, they go back to being the full-time university student. So there's a really high range of people who are involved in this industry now, but the point is the industry is growing. And it's growing not only in major capital cities, but it's actually now growing in more rural areas or semi-rural areas, down to even local village level, who are mayors or like in Indonesia, like kabupaten elections or in local elections, or barangay captains in the Philippines. So where it's now seen as a crucial part of an election campaign to have social media campaigners as part of your team. And how do we distinguish between a social media campaigner and a disinformation producer? Well, of course, that's very hard to tell, because some people hire these, say, university student campaigners with the idea that they're only pumping out good information about their candidate. But then sooner or later, there'll be some negative information about them, and then those campaigners will then try to counter negative information. But then sooner along in the campaign, they realise that they've got to put out negative information about their opposing candidates. And so this cycle of sort of from moving to positive information to negative campaigning to disinformation is generally how it works. We're also seeing that it's more strategically obscured. What I mean by that is that as various techniques of disinformation get exposed, either by Facebook or Twitter itself, or indeed by citizens, they then try to create ways to make these type of campaigns harder to tell for the average citizen. Let me give you one example on that. One would be fake Facebook pages or fake Facebook accounts. And a couple of years ago, it was pretty obvious that you could just get a stock image of any photo on, through a stock image company, put it on Facebook, and then create a fake Facebook account, which then campaigns for your candidate. Facebook started to figure this out, and they started to use more technical algorithms which could figure out whether a stock image was in fact a stock image, and then they could take down that Facebook page. So disinformation producers, as we call them, then started to get pictures of people like you and me from our own Facebook pages and put that up as just an ordinary photo. So if your profile is public and they can go through your profile images, they might select one from a couple of years ago, put it on Facebook, and then show, and then it looks like a more legitimate account. People talk to us about the curating these Facebook pages. So now you can't just be like, I am pro Duterte or I am pro Najib. You have to try and coerce people into being friends with you on Facebook or following your page, which means that you need to create some idea that you are a real person. So a lot of people are creating Facebook pages around K-pop accounts, or local issues is a really obvious one on some Facebook pages. If you follow local Facebook news accounts and they look like local news, and they seem like they're local news because a lot of what they post is local news issues, but then every 5 posts will be, say, a positive story about a senator, or a positive story about a political party, or a negative story about their opposition leader. So they don't do it every time. It's not as obvious as it used to be. And of course, now as people get more involved on social media and as mainstream media declines, we're seeing them now being more influential in shaping political conversations that you're probably very aware of, and that's why you're here today. But let me just talk through some of them. Here's some of the findings. All of this is online, and I'll show you the link towards the end. But of course, this rise of hyper-partisan news, where people are increasingly wanting to follow Facebook accounts which incite and enrage rather than professional journalism news accounts. And secondly, the rise of local news Facebook pages in the region. And this is really interesting for me as a media studies scholar, because people have been talking for a very long time about what happens when local news dies, when local newspapers can no longer be funded and there's no longer any space for local news. And the assumption there is that, well, we just don't get any local news anymore, that people will just read the New York Times or Malaysia TV or whatever, and there's not going to be any sort of local news anymore. But in fact, it seems that there is still a yearning and a need for local news in terms of what citizens want to read. So a lot of social media political campaigners are creating local news Facebook pages to fill that void. But of course, they're created by PR companies, and their main purpose is really to try and get followers to then campaign for their political candidate at election time. And it's amazing how early these sites are getting set up. So really, Malaysia needs to be thinking about 2024 election now to look at the sites that are being created on Facebook that might be local news sites. Now, as I said, this is all in the recent Philippines context, so I haven't done research on pages which are being set up now in Malaysia, but the trend suggests that if you want to build a following for an election, you've got to start 2 or 3 years in advance. And so that's what's been happening in the region more broadly. We're also seeing some really innovative ways of, I guess, online or social media influences. Political parody accounts are really popular in the region. Obviously, you know, part of this is jokes and humour, but this is the stuff that really gets shared on WhatsApp and on Facebook. Pop culture accounts, of course, are rising, and probably a more entertaining rise of nano-influence is thirst trap Instagrammers. Of course, Instagram being the platform of choice for most people in Southeast Asia between the ages of about 18 and 23, or in terms of voting age, even lower if you're not counting voting age, 15 to 23. People are using Instagram a lot. And so we're seeing now that these really popular Instagrammers are getting money to campaign or at least post about a particular political candidate. And so, yeah, they look like that they're exposing their muscles or whatever, and then every 5 posts you'll see a post about a senator or a post about a politician. So the answer to a lot of these problems globally and also in Southeast Asia has been to say that the internet is now weaponized. And so if you just Google, weaponized internet, you'll find all of this material from journalists trying to, I guess, talk this up as a war-like response. And I think that's problematic. I think that's not how we need to think about the social media era or the digital era. And as I started the topic, to think about the changing nature of the information society. And I don't think we need to think about it as warlike, because I think that response has led to this idea that we need to bring all these new draconian laws which then crack down. How do you destroy a weapon, or how do you nuke a weapon? You try and destroy it through some really strict law that needs to stop such a crucial and overbearing problem in society. So we've had Malaysia's anti-fake news bill, we've had POFMA in Singapore, in Indonesia there's been the use of Undang-Undang ITE, which is the Electronic Transactions Law of 2008, which is largely being used to arrest citizens for creating hoax news. And this arrest has been generally been completely for those who have criticised the president. So the problem, as we know, with most of these laws is they get politicised, and that's why Malaysia got rid of the anti-fake news law, because it was clearly a politicised law in order to crack down on material on, posting on 1MDB and various other anti-nudging material. But this, unfortunately, is what happens when other laws are being brought in the region as well. First in Indonesia, and also now in Singapore. Now, the Singaporeans created POFMA with this idea that, no, we're only going to crack down on the syndicates, on the disinformation producers. We're not going to crack down on individuals or free speech. And of course, who were the first candidates that have been arrested or told to respond to these laws, it's been opposition politicians. So I think Malaysia is now at the point, and I think everybody agrees that in Malaysia can't have a POFMA-style law here, otherwise it will end up being highly politicised, and that's been the trend in the region. So to conclude, I don't like the idea that we think of weaponisation of media. We need to think more about why hoax news works, and what are some answers there beyond draconian laws. How do we solve these problems beyond draconian laws? And that's what I'll spend just the last 10 minutes or so of my presentation on thinking about why it is that hoax news spreads and what it is that we can do about it. And hopefully this is relevant to the workshop that will continue throughout the day. The first thing to think about is Southeast Asia is unique in many ways because it has millions of citizens who are literally sitting on the digital divide bridge. When I say unique, I mean different from Australia, America, and UK, which is what a lot of people like to compare Southeast Asia to in terms of rising polarisation, fake news problem, etc., etc. But actually, there's millions of Southeast Asians who are using the internet really for just two things, and that's Facebook and WhatsApp. And a lot of these people really don't have fast broadband, they don't have a lot of apps that they're using, they're not necessarily Googling things, they're not using Google Maps and Grab and these kind of things. So we're really talking about citizens, I've got a little map here. This was during the election, just to give you some idea of the way in which Malaysian citizens might use the internet. And so what I mean by this is some of the methods that fact checkers or Google or Facebook might say, oh, this is how you can solve misinformation, disinformation problems, are not really going to work in Malaysia due to the nature of the way people use the internet outside of urban areas. Here's a close-up of the region I was spending in Kedah. You don't really need to know the details other than to say that when the signal is not particularly strong in various areas, it means that people are really only going to use smartphones and the internet to use for simple messaging apps and simple social media applications and platforms. Why this is important is because, let me click it properly. When you look at some of the people who are sharing fake news, studies often show that it's older people, and it's older people who are really only using Facebook and WhatsApp. Now, I don't need to explain this to you because you're probably part of a WhatsApp group with your uncle or your mother or your brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, who is sharing this kind of information. But I think it's important to think about the way in which they use the internet. And I'll come back to some solutions to this problem soon. But the other point to make just from this election research was the way in which Facebook and WhatsApp was crucial in shifting discourse around Barisan Nasional and around the way in which 1MDB and Najib was discussed in rural areas. As I said, I'm talking about Kedah, where I spent the election period. But it's interesting to think about the way in which, when I talk to citizens in these areas, what do you think about the election? What do you think about the Prime Minister? Their answer would often be, Prime Minister very corrupt. And you say, oh, okay, why do you think that? Well, because of Facebook. Oh, okay, what do you see on Facebook? Oh, well, it's clear. You look at all the 1MDB stories on Facebook. And there's a lot of content about Rosma, of course. There's a lot of sexist and misogynist content as well about Rosma. So to define this as fake news is problematic, and in a way, the way in which citizens were able to access new media platforms and the way in which this new information society spread throughout Malaysia was a big part of how a lot of semi-rural Malay older generation voters may have turned away from the Barisan Nasional in the last election, because they're receiving information that they weren't receiving in previous elections. So we need to keep that in mind when we think about the transformative effects of social media and this kind of information that is being spread. I'll spin through some of this stuff. So to get back to the idea of what is disinformation, there's still a lot of ways in which scholars are trying to figure out why people share fake news. But it's important, I guess, to say today that it's not necessarily just out of lack of knowledge or out of lack of understanding that material is fake news. Sometimes it is, of course, but in sometimes we're talking about citizens who might either have a lack of trust in the state, as is the case in G14, where people didn't trust mainstream media products. Or in some cases, you're talking about people who know that information is not true, in the case of some of the information that's getting shared, but they're making a political statement. They want to ally themselves with a certain political candidate, even though the material is not true. And this is a difficult decision now for the Ministry of Communications if they're going to try and think about what kind of laws or regulations or commissions or councils can try to solve this problem of misinformation. If somebody knows that something is fake, but they're putting it up as a political statement because they want to just show their support for a candidate, do they deserve to be arrested? If somebody shares something that they didn't know was fake, but they thought because it came from a political party or it came from somewhere else, should they get arrested or get reprimanded or be told to take it down? There's really difficult issues around how people conceive and believe or don't believe in fake news, and then what should be done about it. And just a quick note to say that obviously this is all in conjunction, and this is some Indonesia research in declining trust in mainstream media. The final point, and just 2 slides to continue. The first point, I guess, is to think about the way in which Southeast Asia in particular overshares information. And what I mean by that is if you've spent any time in kampungs or in rural areas of Southeast Asia, as I have particularly in Indonesia, you know that there's a lot of gossip and chat and misinformation in the way in which society works anyway. This is pre-internet, pre-smartphone, pre-WhatsApp. The way in which people just sort of, oh, yeah, I heard blah, 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 or, oh, well, my neighbor told me this. And a lot of the way in which information was shared is done because of during an authoritarian society, people didn't have a huge trust in the official sources of information. Let me give you just one example of this. In Indonesia recently, there was a case where a hospital was shown to be inoculating babies just with water. So there were fake inoculations. And so this was eventually exposed, and one of the media organisations found out that this was the case, and they reported on it quite accurately. And then the hospital came out and said, well, this is terrible, but we're going to get to the bottom of this. And the government said, yes, this is appalling, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. And the mainstream media generally reported it, and then they went back, to Jakarta. And so what did the mothers of the babies in this area decide to do? Well, their first port of call, their first action was to form a WhatsApp group, because they believed that they were more likely to be able to share information and get accurate and reliable information from each other than they were from the government or the media, the mainstream media, which had long gone, or the hospital itself, because they know that they'll probably try and cover it up. So they started a legal suit, all done through WhatsApp. They'd never met before. It was all just, joining WhatsApp group. Hi, my baby is this years old. It was inoculated in the hospital on this date. And so they tried to find out who was the doctor responsible, how the babies were, which babies were inoculated on what certain days, and what should be a legal response. And their sources of information which they found most reliable were their own WhatsApp groups. So you can understand that that's the nature of the information society in which many people operate. They trust each other and their own personal communications, as they have done for years in villages, over official sources of information. And so that's interesting when we think about this idea of fake news. So what are some solutions? I guess that I'll just talk through these quickly, but the first solution is to think about how digital literacy programs need to be different from old media literacy programs. And what I mean by that is that the history of media literacy, at least in the West in particular, has always been about knowing who the owners of the media are, how bias might be construed in media, not to trust media content at face value, to think more about what might be behind the story. That's traditionally how media literacy programs have been. I think younger people and urban people in particular are across this now. When I talk to students in Australia or Indonesia or Malaysia, they all talk about how the media is biased. They all say, oh, media is partisan, you can't trust the media. So we're actually at a point now where we need to show what is good journalism, what is some good examples of the media, what media can be trusted and why should they be trusted. Why is professional journalism different to the Facebook pages that you're seeing on local news sites? What is the difference between a Malaysia Kini report and a Malaysia Chronicle report, for example? They're not all the same, and that's the problem I think that we're seeing in media literacy programs, and that's why they need to change from what we've been doing previously. I think increasing internet speed and access will ultimately be a good thing, and I say that because, to go back to those millions of people who are only using Facebook and WhatsApp, the more access they have to information and the more they can use Google and have access to a wider range of things on the internet, the better. So I'm generally against Facebook's free basics because it limits people to Facebook, and I don't think that's a good thing for society. We need credible civil disinformation laws in the region and sensible police prosecution. That's pretty obvious. Criminal defamation laws are generally used by the powerful on the powerless, and so credible civil defamation laws really need to be more common. This is a big issue for Malaysia at the moment, a credible public service media. Indonesia, of course, went from authoritarianism to democracy in the late 1990s, and in the early 2000s, everyone was talking about, we need to transform TVRI and Antara from a state news organisation to a public broadcaster. Now, people are saying that now about Purnama and KTM. RTM, and TV3 and TV1 and so on. Now, this is such a difficult task, but the lessons from Indonesia has been you probably need to replace all of the top echelon of leadership within those organisations. You need to sack the dinosaurs that still believe that these organisations are state broadcasters, and their interest is to support the interest of the government of the day. And that mentality still hasn't changed in Indonesia because they've kept those people on who still have a new order view of what these state broadcasters should be. And Malaysia, I think, needs to do something similar. Good luck with that, by the way, but that's what I think needs to happen. Much more responsibility on Facebook and Google and Twitter to take down some of this stuff. If we go back to my earlier presentation about the rise of disinformation producers, the thing that scares them the most, more than anything else, is not fact checkers, it's not journalists writing about, it's takedowns by the platforms, because that ruins all the work that they've been doing over years, and it means that they get exposed as disinformation producers, not credible PR companies, and it means that all those followers that they built up is suddenly reduced. So Google and Facebook and Twitter, if they were here, they'd tell you about how wonderful they're doing working with fact checkers and how they're not scared about fact checkers. And these people in semi-rural areas who are only using Twitter and Facebook, they're not looking at fact checkers. Now, I don't want to say that fact check work is not important, because it genuinely is, but Facebook takedowns is what scares the disinformation producers, and that these companies just aren't doing enough. And they're using fact checkers as a PR stunt to say that they are. Finally, we need to think more about building better online news spaces, digital participatory media, and of course, if I had an answer to this and if I could do it myself, I'd try, but I genuinely don't know how this is going to operate. But there's certainly a need for more credible online digital platforms that people, younger people in particular, engage with. The amount of younger people now who are really just using Instagram, forget about Twitter and Facebook as news, who are just using Instagram as their way of being part of this information society, suggests we are getting a more apolitical, as in Instagram is very apolitical, right? It's a lot of photos, there's not a huge amount of sort of professional journalism doing good things with Instagram. It's very difficult. But I think we need to think about how to do that. I don't know how, and if I did, I wouldn't tell you I'd make millions of dollars trying to do it. But I think we need to think about how to create better professional journalism in this era. Again, a huge challenge, but why not just put it out there. So if you want to read more, all of this stuff is open access. The newmandela.org disinformation has the full report, including a report about policy outcomes, which is what I presented to the Minister of Communications yesterday, Robin, and there's some stuff on an article on Malaysia's election and some stuff on Indonesia. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I think we have time for questions and answers, so hopefully I can answer some of your questions if there's anything I haven't covered. And of course, feel free to disagree, because you're all living in this environment now, albeit I presume a largely urban, educated environment, but I'd be very happy to hear any criticisms or feedback.